Part 1. The galaxy was old. The stars had burned for billions of years before life crawled from the mud of 1,000 worlds. And on those 1,000 worlds, species had risen, looked up at the night sky, and wondered if they were alone. They were not alone. They had never been alone. The first species to reach the stars called themselves the. They were tall and thin, with silver skin that reflected light like mirrors. They had discovered faster-than-light travel when humanity's ancestors were still learning to walk upright. For millions of years, they spread across the galaxy, building great stations and vast networks of trade. They met other species along the way, some older than themselves, some younger. Together, they formed what they called the Concord of Ascending Peoples. The Concord had one purpose above all others: to manage the rise of new species. They had seen what happened when young civilizations grew too fast: wars that burned entire star systems, weapons that cracked planets like eggs, plagues that spread from world to world until whole species vanished. The elder races had learned hard lessons, and they believed they had a duty to teach those lessons to others. They called it guided development, others called it control. When the Concord first detected radio signals from a small blue world orbiting a yellow star, they watched with mild interest. The signals were primitive, full of music and voices and strange patterns of light and sound. The species that made them called themselves humans. They were small, fragile creatures with short lives and loud emotions. They fought each other constantly. They destroyed their own environment. They seemed determined to wipe themselves out before they ever reached the stars. The Concord made a decision. Humanity would be guided, like all the others before them. The first contact happened on a cold night in the mountains of a place humans called Switzerland. A ship descended from the sky, and beings from another world stepped onto Earth's soil for the first time. The humans who greeted them were terrified and amazed in equal measure. The ambassador, a being named, spoke to them in their own language, learned from decades of listening to their broadcasts. "We come in peace," said. "We are here to welcome you to the galactic community." The humans wept with joy. They were not alone. The universe was full of life, and that life wanted to be their friend. What the humans did not understand was that friendship, in the language of the Concord, meant something very different from what they imagined. In the years that followed, humanity changed faster than any species the Concord had ever seen. They learned from the technology the elder races shared with them. They built new machines, new cities, new dreams. Within a single generation, they had fusion power and ships that could travel to the edges of their own solar system. Within 2 generations, they were mining asteroids and building stations in orbit around distant moons. The Concord watched this with growing concern. Humans were advancing too quickly. They were skipping steps, jumping ahead, refusing to follow the careful path that other species had walked for centuries. Something had to be done. The economic chains came first. A trading company arrived in human space with a simple offer. They would sell fusion reactors to humanity at prices far below what human companies could match. The reactors were better, cheaper, and more reliable than anything humans could build. It was a gift, they said, a sign of friendship between peoples. Human energy companies collapsed within months. Why spend money developing your own technology when you could buy something better from the stars? The engineers who had built humanity's fusion industry found themselves without jobs. The factories that had made the reactors went silent. The knowledge that had taken decades to develop began to fade, replaced by dependence on alien machines. The same pattern repeated itself across every industry. Human asteroid miners could not compete with Concord prices. Human shipbuilders could not match Concord quality. Human scientists found that their research was always just behind what the elder races had already discovered. No matter how fast humanity ran, the Concord was always one step ahead, offering to sell them what they were trying to build. Within a century, humanity's economy was tangled in a web of alien trade agreements, alien loans, and alien dependencies. They had ships that could cross the solar system in days, but they did not know how those ships worked. They had power plants that could light cities for 1,000 years, but they could not build new ones without Concord help. They had become customers instead of creators. The diplomatic chains came next. Humanity was welcomed into the Concord with great ceremony. There were speeches and celebrations and promises of eternal friendship. The humans who attended the great assembly on the Concord's capital world felt small and young compared to the ancient beings around them, but they also felt hopeful. They were part of something bigger now. They had a voice among the stars. That voice, they soon discovered, was very quiet. Humanity was given observer status, which meant they could watch the Concord make decisions but could not vote on them. Their proposals were studied by committees that met once every decade. Their complaints were filed in archives that no one ever read. Their requests for new technology, for trade rights, for simple recognition as equals were met with patient smiles and gentle explanations. "You are still young," they told them. "In time you will understand. In time you will be ready." The humans who had dreamed of standing among the stars found themselves sitting in waiting rooms instead. The cultural chains were more subtle, but perhaps more powerful. Earth was flooded with alien entertainment. Stories from species that had lived for millions of years, filled with heroes who had witnessed the birth and death of stars. Music created by beings who could hear frequencies humans could not imagine. Art that made human paintings look like the scribbles of children. Humans began to feel small. Their history, which had seemed so long and rich, was barely a footnote in the great record of galactic civilization. Their heroes, who had seemed so brave and important, were just footnotes in a story that had been going on long before Earth existed and would continue long after it was gone. Their struggles, their triumphs, their dreams all seemed insignificant compared to the vast sweep of cosmic time. Young humans stopped learning about their own history. Why bother when the history of the galaxy was so much more interesting? They stopped telling their own stories. Why bother when alien stories were so much better? They stopped believing that they had anything valuable to offer the universe. They were just one small species on one small world, lucky enough to have been found by wiser, older beings. The military chains were the most obvious. Humanity was forbidden from developing certain weapons. Antimatter warheads, planet crackers, sun killers, these were too dangerous for a young species, the Conquered explained. They were also forbidden from building certain engines, certain shields, certain systems that might allow them to fight on equal terms with the elder races. These restrictions were for humanity's own protection, of course, for stability, for peace. To enforce these rules, the Conquered built stations in humanity's solar system. Peacekeeping stations, they called them. The humans who lived beneath their shadows called them prisons. 200 years after first contact, humanity had changed beyond recognition. They had cities on a dozen worlds and stations scattered across 3 star systems. They had technology that their ancestors could not have imagined, but they had lost something important along the way. They had lost their fire. The humans who had once looked at the stars with wonder now looked at them with resignation. The species that had climbed from caves to skyscrapers in a heartbeat of cosmic time now accepted that their climb was over. They had reached their place in the universe, and that place was at the bottom. The Conquered watched this transformation with satisfaction. The pattern had repeated itself 1,000 times before. Young species always burned bright at first, full of energy and ambition, but the chains always worked. In time, every species learned its place. In time, every fire dimmed. Humanity, they believed, was no different. In the great halls of the Conquered, the elder races spoke of humanity as a success story. A dangerous species, wild and unpredictable, had been tamed. Their growth had been managed, their ambitions channeled, their potential controlled. They would make useful customers and loyal followers. In a few thousand years, they might even be allowed to join the Conquered as full members. The chains had held. just as they always did. But deep in the hearts of humanity, something still burned. It was small and quiet, hidden beneath layers of resignation and acceptance. It was the same fire that had driven their ancestors to leave the safety of the trees and walk upright across the savannah. The same fire that had pushed them to cross oceans and climb mountains and reach for the sky. The conquered had studied humanity for centuries, but they had made one critical mistake. They had looked at what humans were and assumed that was what humans would always be. They had measured human strength and found it wanting. They had measured human technology and found it primitive. They had measured human ambition and found it manageable. What they had failed to measure was something that could not be weighed or counted or controlled. They had failed to measure the human spirit. And the human spirit was about to remind the galaxy why chains were made to be broken. Part 2. The spark that would change everything began in a place the conquered had never thought to watch. Luna, Earth's ancient moon, had become a backwater in the centuries since first contact. The mining operations that had once made it valuable had been abandoned when cheaper alien alternatives arrived. The research stations that had once pushed the boundaries of human knowledge had been closed when alien knowledge made human science seem pointless. The moon was a graveyard of old dreams, forgotten and ignored. That made it the perfect place to remember. Doctor was 73 years old when she returned to Luna. She had spent her life working in alien laboratories, studying alien science, learning alien ways of thinking. She had been good at it, good enough that the conquered had praised her as an example of what humans could achieve when they accepted guidance. But something had always bothered her, a question she could never quite silence. Why did human ideas always seem to be wrong? For 200 years, humanity had been taught that their science was primitive, their theories flawed, their understanding limited. Whenever a human scientist proposed something new, the conquered would smile and explain why the idea had already been tried, already been disproven, already been surpassed by superior alien knowledge. Humanity had stopped proposing new ideas. What was the point? But had noticed something strange in her decades of study. Alien science was advanced, yes, but it was also static. The same theories that had been taught 1,000 years ago were still being taught today. The same technologies that had been developed millions of years ago were still being used. The elder races had reached a certain level of understanding and stopped there, content with what they knew. Humans had never been content with what they knew. Gathered others who shared her questions. Engineers who had grown tired of maintaining machines they did not understand. Scientists who had grown frustrated with being told their ideas were worthless. Dreamers who remembered a time when humanity had reached for the stars with their own hands, not with borrowed tools. Together, they built something new. It started small, just a handful of people working in abandoned tunnels beneath the lunar surface. They had no funding, no support, no approval. What they had was curiosity and determination, and a stubborn refusal to accept that humanity had nothing left to offer. They began by asking a simple question: what could humans do that the elder races could not? The answer, they discovered, was everything the conquered had never thought to try. Alien science was built on certainty. The elder races had spent millions of years perfecting their understanding of the universe, and they believed that understanding was complete. They knew how physics worked, how chemistry worked, how biology worked. They had no reason to question their knowledge because their knowledge had served them well. Human science was built on doubt. Humans had spent their entire history being wrong, discovering their mistakes and starting over. They had learned to question everything, to test everything, to throw away ideas that did not work and try new ones. They were not afraid of being wrong because being wrong was how they learned. The researchers on Luna began exploring ideas the conquered had dismissed centuries ago. Theories that did not fit the established framework. Approaches that seemed impossible according to alien understanding. technologies that the elder races had never developed because they had never needed them. And slowly, impossibly, they began to succeed. The breakthrough came from a young engineer named. He was working on a problem that the Conquered said had no solution: how to build a faster-than-light engine without using the rare materials that only the elder races controlled. Every human attempt to solve this problem had failed because they had been trying to copy alien designs, tried something different. He started from scratch. The engine he built was ugly. It was inefficient. It was nothing like the elegant machines the Conquered used. But it worked. It used materials that could be found anywhere, built with tools that humans could make themselves, powered by principles that alien science said were impossible. When showed his creation to the others, they stared at it in silence, then began to laugh, and soon they were all laughing, tears streaming down their faces. For the first time in 2 centuries, humanity had built something new, something that was theirs, something that did not come from alien hands or alien minds. The economic chains began to crack. Word spread quietly through human space, passed from person to person in whispers and coded messages. The Conquered monitored human communications, but they were looking for rebellion, for anger, for resistance. They were not looking for hope. Small workshops began appearing on distant worlds and forgotten stations. Humans started building their own machines again, using designs that came from Luna. They were not as good as alien technology at first. They were cruder, simpler, less efficient. But they were human. They could be improved, modified, adapted. They could grow. Human traders began offering goods that the Conquered did not sell. Artisanal products, they called them. Handcrafted, unique, valuable precisely because they were different. Alien customers, bored with the same perfect products they had been buying for, discovered something new and interesting. Human craftsmanship became fashionable, then valuable, then essential. The Conquered noticed, eventually. But they did not worry. What harm could a few primitive human machines do against the vast economic power of the elder races? They did not understand that humans were no longer trying to compete. They were trying to escape. The diplomatic chains broke next, in ways the Conquered never saw coming. Humanity was not the only young species in the galaxy. There were hundreds of others, all at various stages of guided development. They had been kept apart from each other, taught to look up to the elder races, discouraged from forming connections that might threaten the established order. A human diplomat named Sarah changed that. Sarah had spent 20 years working in the Conquered's bureaucracy, filing papers and attending meetings and being ignored. She had learned how the system worked, where the gaps were, what the elder races failed to notice. And she had learned something else, something important. The young species were tired. They were tired of being told to wait, tired of being treated like children, tired of watching their dreams being managed and controlled and slowly suffocated. They wanted more, just like humanity wanted more. They just did not know how to get it. Sarah began reaching out to them. Not officially, not through proper channels. She met them in corridors and cafeterias and quiet corners where no one was watching. She shared stories from Earth, stories about humans who had refused to accept their limits. She shared technology from Luna, designs that any species could use and improve and make their own. She shared hope. A network formed in the shadows of the Conquered. Dozens of species, sharing information and ideas and dreams. They called themselves the Reaching, because they were all reaching for something the elder races said they could never have. The cultural chains shattered when humanity remembered who they were. A human artist named James Wright created a series of paintings that changed everything. They were not beautiful by alien standards. They were rough and emotional and full of pain and triumph and struggle. They showed human history not as a small footnote in the galactic story, but as something magnificent in its own right. One painting showed the first humans leaving Africa, walking into an unknown world with nothing but courage and determination. Another showed the first ships crossing the oceans, tiny against the vast waters. Another showed the first rockets reaching for space, flames and smoke and desperate hope. The final painting showed Earth as seen from Luna, a small blue marble hanging in the darkness, and beside it, a human hand reaching upward toward the stars. James called the series, "We Were Never Meant to Stop." The paintings spread across human space like wildfire. Humans who had forgotten their history learned it again. Young people who had grown up believing their species had nothing special discovered that their ancestors had conquered every obstacle the universe had thrown at them. The stories that had seemed small and unimportant suddenly seemed powerful and inspiring. Humans started telling their own stories again. They started singing their own songs. They started believing for the first time in generations that they mattered. The military chains were the last to fall, and they fell without a single shot being fired. Doctor was a theoretical physicist who had spent her career studying the forbidden technologies. She was not trying to build weapons. She was just curious, trying to understand why some things were not allowed. The conquered had always said these technologies were too dangerous, too destructive, too powerful for young species to handle. Discovered the truth. The forbidden technologies were not weapons. They were tools. Tools that would allow any species to travel as fast as the elder races, to build as powerfully, to compete on equal terms. They had been forbidden not because they were dangerous, but because they were threatening. They would break the monopoly the elder races held on power and knowledge and control. When published her findings, she knew she was putting herself in danger, but she did not care. The truth was more important than her safety. She shared her equations with every species who would listen. The mathematics were beautiful in their simplicity. Any civilization with basic technology could understand them. Any civilization with determination could use them. The chains had not failed because they were weak. They had failed because humanity had never stopped pulling against them, never stopped questioning, never stopped reaching. And now the other young species were pulling too. The galaxy was about to change. Part 3. The Conquered's great chamber had not seen an emergency session in 4,000 years. The last one had been called when a dying star threatened to destroy 3 inhabited systems. This one was called because of something far more dangerous. Humanity had broken free. The elder races gathered in their ancient seats, beings who had watched empires rise and fall, who had seen stars born and die, who had guided the development of 1,000 species across 1,000,000 years. They were not used to being surprised. They were not used to being afraid. They were both now. The same ambassador who had made first contact with humanity 2 centuries ago stood before the assembly. His silver skin reflected the lights of 1,000 worlds displayed on the chamber's walls. His voice was calm, but those who knew him could hear the worry beneath it. "The situation is unprecedented," he said. "In all our history, no species has broken the chains of guided development. The system was designed to be unbreakable. Every restriction reinforced every other restriction. Economic dependence led to diplomatic weakness. Diplomatic weakness led to cultural submission. Cultural submission led to acceptance of military control. The cycle has worked without fail for millions of years." He paused, looking at the faces around him. Until now. The conquered spent days arguing about what to do. Some called for immediate intervention. Send the peacekeeping fleets to human space, they said. Impose new restrictions, harsher controls, stricter limits. Remind humanity of their place in the galactic order. Others urged caution. Humanity had allies now, dozens of young species who had joined their network. An attack on humans would be seen as an attack on all of them. The conquered might win such a conflict, but the cost would be enormous. A few suggested something different. Perhaps, they whispered, the time had come to consider change. Perhaps the old ways were not working anymore. Perhaps the galaxy needed to find a new path forward. These voices were drowned out by the louder ones. The elder races had been in control for too long to imagine giving it up. While the conquered argued, humanity continued to advance. The technology from Luna spread to every corner of human space and beyond. Ships with human-designed engines, built from common materials, began appearing everywhere. Stations that did not depend on conquered supplies started operating independently. Research facilities that explored ideas the elder races had forbidden opened on a dozen worlds. The economy that had been designed to keep humanity dependent began to collapse. Human goods flowed through new trade networks that did not pass through conquered checkpoints. Human knowledge spread through channels the elder races could not monitor. Human influence reached places the conquered had controlled for. The young species of the reaching grew bolder every day. They stopped waiting for permission from the elder races. They stopped accepting limits that had been placed on them without their consent. They started building their own futures, using the tools humanity had shared with them. And through it all, humans kept reaching higher. The conquered finally reached a decision. They would demand that humanity cease its independent development. They would insist that the young species return to their proper place in the galactic order. They would use force if necessary. Was chosen to deliver the ultimatum. He traveled to human space himself, arriving at a station that had not existed 2 decades ago, built entirely with human technology and human hands. The human ambassador who met him was not what he expected. Wei was an old woman with gray hair and tired eyes. She had spent her life working in factories on Earth, building machines that humans had designed but could no longer understand. She had watched her children grow up in a world where human dreams seemed small and pointless. She had seen her species lose its fire. And then she had seen it return. Wei had risen through human society not because she was brilliant or powerful, but because she understood something important. She understood what it felt like to be told you had reached your limit. She understood what it meant to refuse to accept that limit. She understood the quiet, stubborn strength that had carried humanity from caves to stars. When delivered the conquered's demands, Wei listened patiently. She did not argue, she did not threaten, she did not show fear. When he finished, she simply asked him to come to the viewing deck. They stood together before a vast window looking out at the stars. Ships hung in the darkness, vessels from 100 different species, all built with technology that had not existed a generation ago. They were not warships. They were exploration vessels, science platforms, trading ships. They were the future. "I want to tell you a story," Wei said. She spoke of Earth's history, not the grand events that were recorded in the galactic archives, but the small moments that had defined humanity. A woman in ancient Africa who had picked up a sharp stone and imagined a tool. A sailor who had looked at the horizon and wondered what lay beyond it. A dreamer who had watched birds fly and believed that humans could fly too. "We have always been told no," Wei said. "By our own bodies, by our own planet, by the universe itself. And we have always refused to listen. Every chain that bound us became a ladder we climbed. Every wall that blocked us became a door we opened. Every limit that was placed on us became a challenge we overcame." Started to speak, but Wei held up a hand. "I know what you are going to say. We are young. We are reckless. We do not understand the dangers. We need guidance." She turned to face him directly. Perhaps that was true once. Perhaps there was a time when humanity needed protection from itself, but that time has passed. We have learned from our mistakes. We have grown. And we have discovered something that the elder races seem to have forgotten. "What is that?" asked. "That the point of life is not safety," Wei said. "It is growth. It is struggle. It is reaching for things that seem impossible and finding out that they were possible all along. You tried to protect us from failure, but failure is how we learn. You tried to save us from risk, but risk is how we grow. You tried to keep us safe, but safety is not living." She gestured at the ships outside the window. Those species out there, the young ones who joined us, they were dying, not physically but spiritually. They were losing the fire that had lifted them from their home worlds. They were forgetting how to dream. We reminded them. We showed them that the limits they had accepted were not real. We showed them that the chains could be broken. Was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. And what would you have us do? Abandon the order we have built over millions of years. Let chaos rule the galaxy. Wei shook her head. We do not want chaos. We want partnership. The elder races have knowledge and wisdom that we lack. We have energy and creativity that you have lost. Together, we could build something better than what exists now. A galaxy where every species is free to grow, to fail, to learn, to reach for the stars in their own way. She smiled, the first smile she had shown during their conversation. You have been shepherds for a long time, but we do not need shepherds anymore. We need partners, we need equals, we need friends. The message was carried back to the conquered. It was debated for weeks, months, years. Some of the elder races rejected it completely. They could not imagine a galaxy where they were not in control. They could not accept that the young species had something valuable to offer. But others listened. They were the races who had grown tired of stagnation, who remembered what it had felt like to reach for something new. They were the races who looked at their own ancient civilizations and saw not wisdom but weariness. They were the races who had secretly wondered if the conquered's way was the only way. Change came slowly, as change always does, but it came. The peacekeeping stations in human space were dismantled. The forbidden technologies were shared openly. The young species were welcomed into the galactic community not as followers but as partners. The chains that had bound so many for so long were finally removed. And humanity kept reaching. They explored regions of space that the elder races had never visited. They developed technologies that the conquered had never imagined. They made mistakes, sometimes terrible ones, and they learned from those mistakes and grew stronger. They brought other species with them, sharing what they discovered, learning from what others taught them. 1,000 years later, the galaxy had changed beyond recognition. The conquered still existed, but it was no longer a council of shepherds managing their flocks. It was a partnership of equals, young and old working together, different perspectives creating something greater than any single species could achieve alone. And at the center of it all, humanity continued to do what they had always done. They looked at the universe and saw not limits but possibilities. They faced challenges and found solutions. They failed and got back up. They reached for the stars and kept reaching even when they caught them. The other species never quite understood how humans did it, how they kept their fire burning generation after generation, how they never grew tired of growing, how they always found one more mountain to climb, one more ocean to cross, one more star to reach. Perhaps it was something in their biology, some genetic quirk that made them incapable of accepting limits. Perhaps it was something in their culture, stories passed down through generations that taught them to never stop reaching. Perhaps it was something deeper, some fundamental aspect of the human spirit that could not be chained or controlled or dimmed. Whatever it was, it had changed the galaxy forever. The humans themselves never thought much about it. They were too busy reaching for the next star. On the memorial that stood at the center of the new galactic capital, built by human and alien hands working together, a simple inscription was carved in 1,000 languages. It said every chain failed, mankind advanced, and they brought us with them. Beneath the inscription, a human hand was carved in stone, reaching upward toward the infinite sky. It was still reaching.